industry, how it operates, how it influences, what its connections are with government, what its connections are with the farming industry, what its connections are with the animal welfare movement. I have an interest in this area because, as well as being Chief Executive of the Badger Trust and Policy Advisor at the Born Free Foundation, I'm a lay member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons Veterinary Nurses Council, so I have a role to play in that sort of broader area, looking at how the Royal College operates, how the veterinary nursing profession is being developed alongside the veterinary profession. And there's a lot been happening in recent years with the RCVS, with changes to its Royal Charter, with its Vets Futures project, where it's working with the British Veterinary Association and the wider veterinary sector, looking at the whole ethics and animal welfare issues of the industry, and how the public actually views the veterinary industry. So you sort of take this broader approach, and I'm looking at this and talking with many senior people within the veterinary profession, as well as working in what at times is quite a controversial issue, an area for the veterinary profession, because I'm obviously fighting to protect badgers. And when I wrote Badger to Death, I actually really tried to capture that in the Vet's Dilemma chapter. If those of you have read it and those of you who haven't, I think you'll find it quite interesting. But what I really wanted to do was try and bring this into the perspective of the Badger Cull debate. And Peter will recall, we met Liz Truss last year. God bless Liz Truss, she's not the sharpest tool when it comes to debating anything, to be honest. And we had this discussion with her where we threw out all these statistics and knowledge of the Badger Cull, and she came back with very little knowledge on anything. But her main defence was that the chief vet, Nigel Gibbons, who was noticeable by his absence in the meeting, had told her this was the right thing to do. On that basis, she had no concerns about pursuing the mass destruction of badgers. And that makes me think, and all of you think, I suppose, about the role of the Chief Veterinary Officer. And also, of course, we have the debate within the British Veterinary Association about free shooting of badgers, and that's something that we've all been engaged in as well, because the ethics, animal welfare committees within the BVA at length looked at the whole issue of free shooting after the independent expert panel did its work in 2013 and finally came to the conclusion in 2015 that free shooting was cruel and ineffective and should actually stop, which made sense and everyone applauded. But then we find the policy of veterinary association is that the actual cull should be able to continue and that they won't object to its mass extension, which includes a significant increase in the free shooting of badgers, which they disagree with on ethical scientific grounds. So that raises very serious questions in my mind, and I've no doubt the panel will discuss some of that in more detail. I suppose the other thing from my perspective is the view we have of the veterinary industry, because it's probably a lot of us have a perspective of vets based upon James Herriot, books we might have read as a child, All Creatures Great and Small, the relationship many of us have with our own vets, which is companion care animal vets. But obviously the veterinary profession is very broad. It's involved in slaughterhouses, it's involved in the livestock farming sector at a significant level, in the sort of science animal testing areas, in zoos, in a lot of areas which we would consider controversial when it comes to the welfare of animals, but you know, the veterinary profession under science regulatory frameworks has roles to play, and vets will play crucial roles in all those industries. So it can be a controversial sector. It's a sector that is divided in its opinion on issues like badger culling. And there are times when you question it, as we did, for instance, when we had our AGM event last year at the University of West of England. I remember John Blackwell, the president of the BVA, who joined us and debated the whole issue of the badger cull, and I asked him, along with Mark Jones here, this whole issue about the relationship vets have with farmers. And I said, surely you can't really be impartial because too many of your members, particularly the British Cattle Veterinary Association membership, have a direct financial dependence on those farmers for their business and their livelihoods, which I can understand. And that in turn will have an influence over their policies and their public statements on the issue of badger culling, which he denied, saying there's no such thing. But I think all of us can see that there probably is a broader issue of concern. So what I really wanted to do today, from the Badger Trust perspective, was bring together a number of experts within the veterinary industry who can really tell us what their views are of where the sector is going at the moment, how we deal with some of these ethical dilemmas, how we deal with some of these potential conflicts of interest that we find within the veterinary industry, and how we can maybe get to a point that rather than be part of the problem, I would say, and that's what I state in the book, the veterinary profession as a whole can be part of the solution when it comes to trying to find a science-based solution to bovine TB that takes account of the problems that farmers face, takes account of the public cost issues for the taxpayer, but also, most importantly from our perspective, takes account of the need to protect wildlife and the importance of animal welfare as well. So that's the key purpose, to a large degree, of the sort of debate we're having today, and that's just some of the pointers I put out for some of our speakers to pick up on. Just to introduce you to our panel, on the right-hand side here, Mark Jones, vet for the Born Free Foundation, works alongside me, obviously a key voice in the anti-badger cull movement, so it's great to have Mark with us. On my left-hand side, we have Alex Simmons. Alex is a former deputy chief deputy chief vet, at DEFRA. You're speaking in a personal capacity today, but you'll give us a view generally, I think, of your experience. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
It is indeed. Okay, thank you very much. And then last not least, we have Liz Molyneux, known many of you as a vet that works closely with Secret World. I think also you've got involvement in some committees on the British Veterinary Association side as well. And you've got a good knowledge of how the framework of decision making to a degree works in that organisation, which I think will be useful for our debates as well. So that's our panel. I must apologise, unfortunately Alistair Macmillan from the Humane Society can't be with us today. He was always on standby because his wife was going in for an operation. He said if she had to go in today, obviously he couldn't be with us. Unfortunately, she has to go in, so he can't be, and he sends his apologies. I will start on my right-hand side with Mark Jones. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dominic. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a pleasure to be here this weekend, and a pleasure to see a lot of faces who I know, some of whom I don't. I think I know quite a lot of you from various meetings. I've had the honour of occasionally acting as a sort of warm-up act to Dominic on some of the badger marches around the country. I can't believe they call you God on a stick, honestly. Thankfully, I won't keep you very long because Dominic's just said everything I was just about to say, so which is marvellous. No, I think it's worth starting by saying that several people this weekend have made the point that expert opinion and scientific evidence is being ignored by government with respect to this policy. But actually there are two sources that would certainly consider themselves to represent expert opinion that have been very heavily relied on by government and ministers, and those two sources are the chief vet within DEFRA and the British Veterinary Association. And I'll just give you a couple of quotes. One from George Eustace, good old George Eustace, on the 30th of August of this year, in DEFRA's statement, which is on its website, and this was when they were announcing the rollout to a number of new areas of badger culling. Just to give you a flavour of the kind of reliance that government is placing on veterinary opinion to some extent in order to try and defend its policy. He said the veterinary advice and the experience of other countries is clear. We will not be able to eradicate this disease unless we tackle the reservoir of the disease in the badger population as well as cattle. And on that, as part of that same statement, the chief vet was quoted. And he was quoted as saying that action to prevent infection of cattle from significant reservoirs of TB infection in local badger populations is an essential part of the government's 25-year strategy to eradicate bovine TB in England, and that proactive badger control is currently the best available option, and the licensing of further areas is necessary to realise disease control benefits at a regional rather than local level. So those are the most recent statements, I think, that have come out at a ministerial level and from the Chief Veterinary Officer on this issue. As for the British Veterinary Association, well, perhaps the most recent thing was where the president or the then president of the BVA was quoted in Veterinary Times, which is one of the veterinary sort of magazines within the profession, on the 23rd of August, reiterating BVA's support for what he calls the wider rollout of culling to carefully selected areas where badgers are regarded as a significant contributor to the high incidence of bovine TB in cattle. So that was the BVA's president's statement in advance of the rollout of culls this year. And this, as Dominic has said, is in spite of the fact that the existing and the new cull licences continue to permit the killing of badgers by so-called controlled shooting, a method the BVA has previously rejected on the grounds that it hasn't been satisfied that the method has been shown to be humane. So these positions taken by very senior veterinary officials and the largest veterinary organisation in the UK, I think are heavily relied on by government and raise some fairly significant and serious questions. So over the past number of years, we, and by we I mean a number of veterinary colleagues and myself, it's not an organised group particularly, but it's a whole range of veterinary colleagues and other scientific experts, have put considerable effort in trying to establish a constructive dialogue with both the Chief Veterinary Officer's Office and the British Veterinary Association through various mechanisms. And those mechanisms have included both private and public correspondence. They've included meetings with both of those bodies and senior officials from both of those bodies. And they've included the provision of evidence by us and the sending of briefings on these issues to these bodies, containing evidence that we think they need to consider when they're looking at their positions on this particular issue. The most recent, just to give you a flavour, the most recent meeting I had with the Chief Veterinary Officer and his staff was, I think, in late spring last year. And it was at a time when a couple of papers, and quite a number of papers about the role of badgers in TV and cattle have come out over the years since the randomised badger culling trial, as I'm sure most of you are aware. And there was a particular peer-reviewed paper that had come out just before we had our meeting with the Chief Veterinary Officer that called into question, as most of them do, the scientific legitimacy of the policy. And we met with the CBO and some of his senior scientific staff. Now, when I went into that meeting, that it seemed to me that instead of considering new evidence and looking at, and this is peer-reviewed evidence, don't forget, and looking at how the policy might need to be perhaps revisited or revised in the light of that new evidence, which is surely the way an evidence-based policy framework should operate, it seemed to me that the CBO staff were there in order to pick apart the new evidence, in order to be able to continue to justify the office's support of the policy in spite of it. And that I found really, really concerning. And since that meeting, I've tried to communicate further with the Chief Veterinary Officer and his staff. I've kind of been told that we don't really have anything more to discuss with you. And my correspondence since then has not really been answered directly. As regards the British Veterinary Association, we've had lots of dealings with the senior executives within that association at a sort of presidential level, and also with lots of vets who are members of BVA and BVA member organisations, and Liz might touch on the sort of structure of the BVA and how that works. Many of whom are very sympathetic to the views that we're putting forward. But the most recent significant correspondence was a briefing that we sent to the BVA president last January. And it was co-authored by a number of vets, including some very, very senior people, such as Ranald Munro, who you may remember was the chair of the independent expert panel that examined the first year of culling, and John Bourne, who was chair of the independent scientific group that oversaw the randomised badger culling trial. And that briefing contained lots of well-referenced, we believe, well-referenced evidence relating to both the way that DEFRA was conducting its policy in relation to cattle measures and in relation to badger culling. And we were asking the BVA basically to re-examine its position on the basis of the evidence that we were providing. And we were also challenging the BVA to explain exactly what it means by carefully selected areas and how it goes about establishing that badgers are significant contributors to bovine TB within those areas in order to fulfil its own stated position of support for the culls. So we sent them the briefing. There was a sort of period of radio silence from the BVA. We were desperate to get a meeting with them. And then in February, we got what we thought might just be a game changer in the form of the publication of the British Veterinary Association's Animal Welfare Strategy. And some of you may have seen this document. It's quite a comprehensive and detailed document. It's a good document, I believe, and it sets out why animal welfare needs to be at the heart of veterinary thinking and veterinary decision making. You may think, well, surely that's always been the case. This is the veterinary profession. Why has it taken until 2016 for the veterinary profession to, or the BVA anyway, to actually make this clear? But anyway, it is what it is. It's a good document. One of the other things that that strategy does is it makes it clear that vets should have a responsibility to consider all animals affected by their actions or by their decisions or by the positions that they take, not just those animals that they're being paid to look after or that are under their care, which has to some extent been a defence that's been used by some vets as to why they shouldn't need to consider the welfare of some classes of animals, including wild animals. So that was a very useful document. And we managed to get a meeting with the then BVA president, I think it was in June, and at that meeting we brought up all these issues, and we said, in the light of your animal welfare strategy, surely there's a case for re-examining the BVA's position on the badger cull issue. And we suggested that they might consider examining that in relation to a number of criteria. We were basically saying, before the veterinary profession in the form of the BVA considers whether or not it should support or otherwise a particular intervention or policy on wildlife, it should surely set various criteria that should be fulfilled in order for it to lend its support. And the bar should be set pretty high, and the bar should be very focused on animal welfare impacts from a veterinary point of view. And we suggested things like the policy should be based on the best available science, it should result in a substantial, predictable and measurable outcome, it should be humane, it should be socially acceptable, it should not result in unintended consequences. It should be undertaken or at least overseen by people who are independent and have no vested interest in the process or the outcome. And it should be adaptive in the face of new evidence. And our contention is that the badger culls, as they're currently being licensed and conducted, fulfil none of those conditions to any degree, and that the veterinary profession, and the BVA in particular, has no business supporting them. Well, to date, we've had no sign of any serious efforts by the BVA or intention by the BVA to reconsider their position, in spite of their new animal welfare strategy and in spite of the briefings and the information we've given them. Indeed, the BVA's representatives in Wales have actually been proactively lobbying within Wales to get badger culling introduced as part of their strategy recently. So that's been extremely disappointing. And the question, that you start to ask yourself after trying to do this for several years is why? Why are we having so much difficulty? We're not expecting the BVA, the CVO, to change their position just because we walk in the room and tell them that they should. But why are we having so much difficulty even to get them to consider the position that they've taken and their policies towards this issue? In the light of evidence that's emerging and that we're highlighting, and in the light of their own strategies, in the case of the BVA, their animal welfare strategies. It's a question that I don't have a simple answer to. In the case of the Chief Veterinary Officer's office, and Alec may be able to shed some light on this for us, I imagine that office is under huge... I don't know what the CVO's personal view on this issue is, but I imagine that his office is under huge pressure to support and deliver the policy, not to spend a lot of time telling ministers why it's wrong. And as regards the BVA, we have to remember that whatever people might think about the British Veterinary Association, ultimately it's a member organisation, and the position it takes is determined by its members through a process of consultation through, again, Liz may be able to shed better light on this, but through its member organisations, and it tends to go and give weight to the opinions of member organisations it considers that have a particular interest in a particular issue. So on bovine TB control, it goes to the British Cattle Veterinary Association. The British Cattle Veterinary Association has many members, not all, who you could argue have vested interests, all kinds of vested interests when it comes to these issues. And the other thing I would say is that, perhaps surprisingly, a lot of vets out there, including vets who are undertaking TB testing, really don't have a particularly good understanding about the limitations of testing or the implications of those limitations in terms of the spread of TB among cattle. So that's pretty worrying. So at this point, I'm supposed to say that I'm not despondent. you know, we all carry on. Actually, I have to say that I often am quite despondent that we find it so hard to break through this kind of wall. But I am inspired when I meet with vets like Liz here. You know, it's fantastic. I meet up with Liz occasionally. Vets like Alistair, who sadly can't be with us today, and I'm sure we all wish his wife all the best. And I'm really encouraged with the discussions I've had with Alec since he's left EFRA, and we've been discussing this issue. And I will finish by saying that by no means all vets are driven by political or self-interest. There are an awful lot of vets out there doing some really, really good work for wildlife. The problem, certainly within BVA, and we can touch on this later, is that wildlife doesn't really fit very comfortably within any of their member organisation structures, so it tends to fall through the cracks. It's not really well represented, and we can talk about maybe how we can change that. And just to say that, despondency aside, we will continue to try and figure out how to galvanise and increase the voice of those vets who are concerned for wildlife, and this issue in particular, broader wildlife issues in general, in order to try and better influence our professional bodies and our representatives in government. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for inviting me. I think it's quite an honour to come here. It's a different environment from what I'm used to.
Can't quite hear you.
Okay, I was
Put it closer.
It might be a bit better.
How's that?
Better.
Better? Okay, well, I'll repeat myself briefly. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honour to be here, and it's a different environment from what I'm normally used to. I'm not going to speak for long. I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about my background and say a few words about what I'm doing now, and a little bit how what I'm doing now has been shaped by my values, which haven't really changed, but are probably coming more to the fore now. I've been a veterinarian for nearly 40 years, but 34 years of that has been in government, one way or another, either in this country or overseas, which probably means that for many of you, I'm not really a proper vet. And I'm quite happy with that. I think the profession, as Liz I'm sure will talk a bit more about, is a very broad church, covers all sorts of areas of work, and the area of work that I was involved in is a proper element of the profession, and I'm proud of what I and my colleagues have achieved whilst I was doing that job. I had a whole series of roles working in disease control, so epidemic disease, endemic disease including bovine TB, working in animal welfare and in public health. And for 3 years I was the veterinary director, that's the chief vet of the Food Standards Agency, and I was 8 years as deputy chief vet when I finished in December of last year. So I've had a year almost away, and since then I've been doing a number of things. I've been indulging myself by travelling and continuing to photograph and watch wildlife, which is what I've been doing since I was a boy, but more and more now. I've been getting involved a little bit in conservation and welfare. I've become a trustee of my local wildlife trust, and I've been doing a bit of work for the RSPB on the crane project, which is the reintroduction of the cranes in the West Country. I'm also trustee of 2 other charities. But the area that I think might be of interest to you is what I've been getting involved in now, and in discussion with Mark and one or 2 other people, is on ethics. And ethics about the killing of wildlife and the management of wildlife, and my views about how badly it is done. And I wouldn't want to concentrate on badges, inevitably that's what the conference is about, but I have strong views about the ethics of killing wildlife of all species. And I've recently published a document which argues for an ethical framework for the management and ultimately, if necessary, in very small numbers, I'm sure, the killing of wildlife. And that was presented at a conference in Surrey just in July. I'm keen to get wider readership for that, so maybe you can help me with it. But in particular, I'm very concerned about the rather casual attitude there is amongst the landowning and land-occupying people in this country to wildlife, and the lack of influence that the citizen has over decisions that are taken. And that would apply to birds, which has been my passion since I was a teenager, right the way through to badgers as well. I've also got involved in the ethics of experimental animals, and I'm not going to go into that in detail, but I'm trying to make sure that I recognise that we're not dealing just with wildlife or domestic animals. I'm very heavily interested in risk, and risk is how you manage risk, and I think we can touch on that if you want over the discussion later on. But issues of ethics and risk are the sorts of things that need to be brought to bear in this debate, and I've certainly got quite different views. They overlap a great deal with Mark's, but different views about how we could and should manage bovine TB. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Liz, thank you.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you very much for the invite to be here. If you don't know me, I'm Liz and I'm a proper vet. I treat sick animals. Sorry.
Just a bit closer to it.
Just bring it close to the answer.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Better?
Yep.
Okay, so about 10 years into being a vet, I moved down to Somerset to a practice that I would eventually buy into. And one of my first nights on duty, I was called out to see a cow on a farm. And after I treated the cow, as used to happen in those days, doesn't much anymore, I was invited in for a coffee with the farmer and his wife. And I went up to the farmhouse kitchen, and the wife was feeding badger cubs. And the rest, as I say, is history. I spent 17 years doing Secret World's clinical work, and so treating their sick animals, and I now work for them as a consultant. I also work for a veterinary company, and that's an interesting example of how the veterinary profession has changed and is changing. Is that we're no longer owned by individuals and families, we're owned by corporates, and many of those corporates have no interest in animal welfare, they just have an interest in making money. So that's kind of been an interesting change in my career. As the others have alluded...
Sorry, but we still can't hear very well.
Can't you? Sorry, that's what Mike's going. I could shout. Is that better? Yeah, okay. As the others have alluded to, I really love the veterinary profession, and I'm therefore quite involved in veterinary organisations. So I did quite a lot with the British Small Animal Veterinary Association. I now sit on the council of the British Veterinary Zoological Society, and that's the organisation that probably best represents wildlife and feeds into BVA in the same way BCVA would feed in about cows. And for my sins, I sit on the British Veterinary Association Policy Committee, and I'm there as an independent, and that's me wanting to be there to be part of the process, because that's how I view being the best way, really, of getting involved with TV and things. As I've said, the veterinary profession is vast, it's changing, it's incredibly diverse, and I think the best way for you not to think about it is it's like we're a cottage society. There are people who really, really love badgers, there are people who really, really hate badgers, and the majority of people in the middle really don't have much opinion. They're not informed, they're not particularly interested. And one example is there's 20,000 vets, 10,000 of them are members of the British Small Animal Veterinary Association, and BSAVA don't vote on badger culling at BVA because they consider it not to be a subject that's of interest to their members. So, you know, that's half of an organisation that's representing half the vets, and probably the vets that do, you know, they are interested in wildlife, we actually pin them down and talk to them. They just say this is not, you know, Mark's tried approaching them, I've tried approaching them. So it is very difficult, and some very extreme views. I spoke at a conference with Pauline a few years ago, well, Cheltenham Science Festival, on a debate, and the first person who stood up basically just said you are a disgrace to the veterinary profession, and then went on for a monologue for 5 minutes about why I was a disgrace to the veterinary profession. I don't know who he was at the time, I do now, and I owe him, and one of these days I'll get my own back. And my partner, who's a farm animal vet, was down in Cornwall last week scanning cows. I went out for dinner with people who I knew were definitely on the other side of the argument, and Phil sent me a text message to say, only one dinner time conversation, kill the blood badgers. So those extreme views of they're very loud, they're very active, and as Mark said, it's very difficult for us to get other views through. On a more positive note, there are a lot of us who like wildlife, and we do try and do some positive things. So BBZS, the Zoo Society, our policy is exactly what you guys would want on culling. Culling's not scientific, DEFRA no longer even begin to follow the science based on the RBCT. What on earth do BBA mean about sustainable and all the other things Mark's raised? So that is BBZS policy. BSABA, having said they don't want to engage their members in this, they do a lot for wildlife in terms of they publish my textbook on care of wildlife, they run courses for veterinary nurses, training them about dealing with wildlife. So there is some good stuff going on out there. It's just we're a minority group, and that's, you guys are a minority group in society. That's the reality, and we need to try and find better ways of engaging with people who at the moment don't have the knowledge and the interest, and we've tried very hard, so maybe we can engage you in helping us in this process. Thank
you. You've heard from our panel. We've now got half an hour, and I'd like to use that to bring as many people in as we possibly could in terms of this debate. It's an important debate. I'm sure you've got different opinions in this audience, but do we have any points or questions anyone would like to bring?
I'm Monica Ward, South Yorkshire Badger Group. During this, it's been a fantastic conference, very, very good, serious things. And we have touched on a cattle vaccine, but what we've heard has been conflicting. And I don't know whether there's a vaccine that's readily available, whether it's coming available in 10 years' time. So I'm going to ask Alex Simmons, who obviously knows a lot about this, what's the position with a cattle vaccine? Have we got one? Why don't we use one? And why is it not there? It's a fundamental thing that will solve our problem. Thank you.
Okay, I can say a few words about vaccine. I can't tell you exactly what kind of death. I think I thought I already was. But
yeah, just pull it a bit closer.
I will come a bit closer.
Yeah.
I can give you a personal perspective on the use of cattle vaccines and their potential, but I can't give you DEFRA's view because that's not what I'm here for. I'm no longer a civil servant, so I don't feel bound to give that point out. My personal view is that the vaccines that are available, which is BCG, and that's the only one that's available, other candidates have been looked at, but they're not technically viable yet, is that it's a waste of time. It's going to be breathtakingly expensive to build the evidence for its efficacy and safety and quality. It will be a hindrance to any of the control systems that are already applied, and if you layer on top of it, it's going to get... Well, if you start to use a vaccine at the same time as trying to eradicate, you will confound both objectives. A vaccine is used to damp down disease, but if you damp down disease at the same time to eradicate it, you will fail. The successful eradications of disease over time, things like smallpox, polio, have relied on the use of blanket vaccination of susceptible people, and after a period of time you stop, because if you continue to use a vaccine forever, then you will no longer be able to identify what pockets of disease are left. Now, polio and smallpox, in comparison with TB, are dead simple diseases. They're stable organisms that have a good, strong, firm immune response, which therefore will allow for vaccines to work very well. TB is a completely different animal. And don't get carried away, please, about the value of BCG in people. It's not a good vaccine. The benefits, the improvements that have been made in public health as a result of in TB prevalence in this country and most of the Western world have been primarily to do with better hygiene, better nutrition, better housing, and so forth. BCG has helped a bit, but nowhere near as much as people think it has.
But other things like diphtheria, chickenpox, they're affected. What I don't understand is if you know, with cattle, you could actually you could vaccinate every cattle in the country overnight, couldn't you? You could arrange it to do that. Yeah. That means that every single, every cow and bull would be covered. So wouldn't that work then? If you're getting rid of it from all of them immediately, why can't that work?
Well, first of all, leaving aside the politics and the legal constraints, which could disappear with Brexit anyway, if you start to use a vaccine at the same time as eradicating it, it will confound both objectives. You could. I became a state veterinarian towards the end of the brucellosis eradication scheme, and we vaccinated for many years, and then we stopped and then eradicated. Because if you continue to vaccinate at the same time as eradication, you will continue to confound the objectives by making the detection of the disease more and more difficult.
So you're saying you'd have to stop doing everything else effectively if you were going to put in a vaccination?
Yes.
So
yes, that's it.
You can have like the area eradication scheme where you kill all the infected animals.
I could talk all day about this,
I'm sorry,
and I'm conscious that there are other things that need to be talked about. But okay, what I'm not keen to do is go into huge amounts of detail here, because inevitably this becomes very complex. But in principle, eradication is very rarely achieved by using vaccine alone. You have to use a stamping out policy towards the end of it. But even if you were going to use vaccination to damp down disease in the first place, which you could do in the West Country and close off the rest of the country, it's a practical possibility, you would still have to use that for many years to bring the prevalence down. And you would still have to recognize, I know this is not going to go down well, you would still have to recognize there would be continuing challenge from the wildlife population. So therefore you're going to have real difficulties. It's not a panacea. It's not like using influenza or a smallpox vaccine.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'll open this to all of you, being vets, we'll know a lot more about it than I. Spinning it completely round from vaccination, because obviously the way we're dealing with it now is clearly not working, hasn't done for decades. It seems to me that we have an ineffective test, we test the herd, we remove the reactors instantly, okay, and then in some cases you will find that a cow passed for 1, 2, I think there's been cases of 4 years, and then it's been found to have had the disease all that time, and so we know the testing's failed. So why aren't we looking at trialling, or perhaps we are, we're just not aware of it, of leaving that disease prevalent within that herd and trying to build up whole herd immunity to that? Because, again, trying to get figures from DEFRA is almost impossible. I've got a strong feeling that a lot of our traditional breeds of cattle are not that susceptible to bovine TB compared to a lot of the foreign bloodlines that were coming in, the way cattle are being kept. So is there a trial programme out there that is keeping this disease prevalent? I think it's, because TB isn't a massive issue when you look at the numbers of cattle that are killed compared to the numbers of cattle we have. So is that not an option we should be pursuing? If you're saying vaccination is not necessarily the answer, what about leaving the disease? Can I open that?
Shall I just say a few words? I will be quick. Innate or acquired resistance to bovine TB has been investigated. I don't know what the outcome of the research was, but the Irish were looking at this for a while. almost certainly it would be partial resistance rather than complete resistance. And the problem with the vaccine, and also with selecting for resistance, which is I think what you're suggesting, and it's a nice idea, is that almost certainly what you would do is not prevent animals becoming infected, you would prevent them becoming diseased. In other words, the animal would become resistant to the disease, but not to the infection. But bear in mind that eradication relies on elimination of the organism. And the problem is that as long as we have a strategy that relies on elimination of the organism from the environment and the population at risk, then you end up with a system of intervention which relies on 100% eradication, which is almost technically, financially, and logistically impossible. And I think that's the problem, that what people are looking for, quite rightly, is solutions, and those solutions, ideally what we want to do is something which is going to make the disease go away. But actually what we're not trying to do is make the disease go away, we're trying to make the organism go away. And it's quite a difficult thing to get your head around, but they are different things. And I certainly believe that the way in which we approach this ought to be we ought to be dealing with making this a disease which is less prevalent rather than trying to seek eradication. Now, in the current climate, politically, and also with our commitments internationally, it's very difficult to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my constant issues with testing is the way we use tests depends on what question we're asking. You know, sorry,
just a bit closer.
Okay.
Pretend you're a rock star.
Yeah. So the tests we're using, I mean, we have to ask ourselves what question are we asking, and if what we want to do is eradicate TB, as they did in, say, Australia, then we do have the test. We have the skin test, which used in its proper way as a herd test, worked very, very efficiently, but it would take all the cows out of the southwest probably overnight. So what we're doing is, you know, we've got conflict with the question we're asking and how we're using the test. So, you know, farmers want to diagnose positive animals, but they don't want to kill any animals, and we don't, when we test our badgers, we don't want to kill any animals that are actually negative. But there aren't tests for TB that do that. You've got to use your test one way or the other. You've either got to maximise the number of animals you detect at the cost of ones that didn't really have TB, or you've got to do it the other way around, where you only pick up true positives, but you leave loads and loads of animals in the herd or in the group of badgers that might still have it. And we seem really conflicted about what we want, and I think there will always be that conflict, because I don't think, as Alex said, eradication in the southwest of England is probably possible. Certainly not within the confines of what government and farmers in the southwest want to continue to maintain. So, I mean, I live in Scotland, and my thing would be I'd just like to see the OTF status move down and down and down, and maybe we're left with a bit of the bottom of the southwest of England where you have to accept a degree of TB, or maybe don't keep cows, but there are other alternatives, because the reality of trying to remove TB from the southwest of England is, well, we're not going to do that. And but the southwest of England obviously has an awful lot of purely voting farmer power, so it's not a very easy one to overcome.
Yeah, I mean, not a huge amount to add to that. I agree with that bovine TB is a challenge because of the nature of the organism. You know, this isn't like some of the viral diseases that are relatively straightforward in terms of how you can stimulate an immune response to them and so forth. So it is, and it's also a challenge because the organism is difficult to detect, and that's reflected in what we all know. I hope we all know in this room, but what we need to educate farmers and vets as well, in terms of the limitations of the testing regime. And Liz is absolutely right when you say that it's not the test itself that's at fault. The test is what it is. It's regarded as a sort of yes or no test. The animal's infected or it's not. But actually, that's not how the test works. you inject the cattle with the antigen, and you get a reaction, and that reaction can be anything from 0 up to whatever the maximum is, and anything in between. And there's a kind of cut-off which is agreed, and the cut-off sometimes changes. They talk about severe interpretation as opposed to normal interpretation. So while the answer that you get back from your tester is this cow's infected, this cow isn't, that's not really what the test tells you. And as Liz rightly says, the test is really designed as quite a good herd test. It has quite a good sensitivity as a herd test. It's not really designed as an individual animal test, but that's how we're using it, and therein lies part of the problem. I think the other problems we face are that we kind of have a legal obligation, Alec touched on this too, because of international commitments to try and eradicate bovine TB, and that's in no small part because it is technically a zoonotic disease which can affect people, although the significance of bovine TB to human health in this country is almost non-existent now because of pasteurisation and various other factors. But that sort of obligation to eradicate is sort of fudged against a political desire to sort of minimise the impact on farms. And we could argue that's why we're doing individual testing instead of herd testing. If you really want to eradicate disease, then you really need to get on top of it if that's your real aim. And also in terms of the cost to the public purse. So there's lots of conflicting pressures on the testing system and the system that we're using to try and eradicate it. And I certainly believe, and I have sympathy with the view that what we should be doing is far more zoning within the country and far more enforced what they call risk-based trading. In other words, preventing the movement of animals between zones. And if you end up with zones maybe in the southwest of England, maybe in southwest of Wales or whatever, where you have persistent issues with TB, then you can deal with those zones on a sort of local basis in whatever way. Either you try and manage the disease, or you have a much more draconian system of whole herd depopulation and so forth, which obviously has huge implications for certain people and certain business, and we shouldn't forget that. But the way we're doing it at the moment is a kind of a fudge, and we're going to be doing this forever. And a cynic would say that there's actually quite a number of people involved in the system that have an interest in seeing it going on forever because it's become their job to try and manage the disease. So that's a very cynical view. I'm not saying I subscribe to that, but I think we're in a mess trying to sort this disease out, to be honest. And badgers are an unfortunate fallout, if you like, from that mess.
Can I just throw something in before we bring this risk factor that you mentioned? Are we overplaying the risk to such a degree that we're just going in the wrong direction with this policy anyway? Because there's no real significant risk to public health anymore because of all the changes we've made, as you've mentioned, across the board, from obviously what we've done with pasteurisation and melting, the slaughterhouse changes over the years, and all the other housing and other things we've done. Cows are not suffering largely from TB because they're slaughtered at 30 months. It doesn't really impact on their overall welfare to a large degree. Most farmers accept that and tell me that. And most people in this room would probably say on the average lifespan of a badger, it doesn't have a significant impact on its overall health, even though we're being told by politicians that we're doing them a favour by blasting them away. So are you of the view, Alec, if you look at the risk factor, that this whole system is wrong because the risk does not really justify the policy? Is that a bold statement?
Yeah, I'm going to extemporize briefly. When I was deputy chief vet, I had somebody came to work for me on a sort of work placement shadowing, and this woman was a veterinary historian, and one of the jobs I got to do was look at the history, or the history of decision making about bovine TB, because I was interested and she was interested. And in the 2 weeks she was working for me, one of the things she came up with was that there was a long debate in the 30s that went on between the health community, that is the public health community, and sort of fronted by the Department of Health, versus the agriculture community, fronted by what was the Ministry of Agriculture, or the Ministry of Department of Agriculture in those days. And the argument was we need to get on top of bovine TB because of the public health risk, and the public health risk in those days was real. In the 30s, there was 3,500 people, I think, dying a year, and many thousands more cases from bovine TB, not human TB. And the argument was we have two options. One is that we require all milk to be heat treated before it goes onto the market, or we aim for eradicating disease within the cattle herd. And both of them are quite rational ways of addressing the risk. And the argument raged. I think it was interrupted by the Second World War, but it raged for a long time. And in the end, the agriculture community won, because what they would have had to do was invest with their little tiny 15 cows and 20 cows, invest in pasteurization equipment at their own expense, and that would have been too expensive. And also at the same time there was a concern about adulteration of food. So in the end what happened was the aim was for eradication of disease in cattle. And at that time, I think it was fair to say that nobody thought there was a reservoir in any species of wildlife that hadn't been identified prior to that. So therefore, elimination of the disease in cattle, having done rinderpest in cattle, pleuropneumonia in cattle, and rabies in dogs, was a reasonable prospect. Now, I would argue that if the facts change so much and the objective hasn't changed, then eradication is not the way to address this problem. The way I believe that we should do it is on the basis of risk. The question you have to ask, and it's important to define it carefully, is what is the risk you're trying to address? What is the hazard? And the hazard is essentially the organism, and the risk is that people get exposed to that through food, or potentially by in contact with infected animals, but mostly through food. If you keep the cattle reasonably healthy by identifying sick animals, by testing them periodically, and you heat treat the milk, that risk goes down to so small you can hardly measure it. And if you do that, this is what I'm really passionate about, is making sure that you make decisions on the basis of good evidence, on the basis of risk. And you can come up with a number of ways in which you would try and manage that risk. I believe that the way we're trying to manage the risk at the moment is wrong, and I believe that there is an alternative way of doing it. And I'm not the only member of the veterinary profession that believes that. There are one or two veterinarians who published papers which have explained that argument more eloquently than I have, but it's a perfectly rational way of doing it. It would be a lot cheaper. We wouldn't need to kill any wildlife, and we would need to kill an awful lot fewer cattle.
Can I you don't speak for the government, but
Absolutely not. No.
Is it fair to say that that view is not an isolated view in Whitehall? There are people in Bedford that would maybe share that opinion.
I think you need to ask them that. I don't know.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Right. We've got some more questions.
Dave O'Dell, Bedfordshire Badger Group. I might be a bit naive, but we were told on Friday that badgers and cattle don't mix. I thought recent research with radio tagging more or less showed that. That's the first point. Second point is, you say most vets, or some vets aren't interested in badgers, they're not interested. If a badger runs around the field screaming in agony for 7 minutes, then they should be interested.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, isn't it? If you go to those vets that, it's not that they're not interested. If you think about, if you're a small animal practitioner, the breadth of animal welfare issues that you might have an interest in would be enormous. There's the dogs and cats and exotic pets coming through your door, but you've also got the dog meat trade in China, you've got rodenticides, there's loads. But what you guys need to do is you need to get exactly that out there, that they need to be aware that this is a really significant animal welfare issue, and it's happening in their countryside down the road from them.
We try.
Yeah, well, I've never had anybody, I've had people come into my practice from, say, Animals Asia, talking to me about bile, farming in bears. I've had lots of, sort of kind of propaganda from other animal welfare things. I've never ever seen anything in veterinary practices you know, from the Badger Trust. And it's not, you know, criticism, because you're doing great stuff out there, but I do think you could target vets. I mean, vets are working on sometimes 10-minute consultations, so it's really annoying when you bring Fluffy in for a vaccine and then you start going on about something else. But, you know, a bit of sort of concise information, you know, could share that, because I do think those BSAVA members, you know, if BSAVA decided they wanted to make this a significant issue for their members, that they lobbied about, they went to BVA about, that would be the turning point. And that's what BCVA are doing. They you know, 1,500 BCVA members, there's 10,000 BSAVA members. You know, if we got the same level of interest, it's a, you know, it's a winning situation. But that's what we're struggling about. But yeah, I agree with you, and we just need to get that message out. And we're maybe not doing it well enough, but we are really trying.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Liz. As we mentioned earlier, to some extent within the veterinary professionals, certainly within the structures, there are some vets out there doing great stuff with wildlife. You know, let's not sort of condemn the whole profession with you know, with the same brush, as it were. But the problem within BVA, it seems to me, and I'm working outside of BVA, and Liz is trying to work within BVA and trying to persuade me to come and work within BVA as well, in order to try and mitigate this. But the problem is that, as we said earlier, wildlife in general, and in this case badgers in particular, sort of fall through the gaps. And because they're not really represented by any of the BVA member organisations. The one organisation that you could argue perhaps should be representing the interests of wildlife is the British Veterinary Zoological Society, which is a BVA member organisation, and it's a relatively small society. It tends to be dominated by zoo vets who have an interest in zoos, or vets who have an interest in exotic pets, that kind of thing. So maybe even that isn't the ideal place to seat concern for domestic wildlife. Maybe we need to create something, but that in itself is a challenge. But the British Veterinary Zoological Society has come out with a very, very good and strong statement, which I'm sure all of us here would agree with in terms of badger culling. The problem is that it isn't seen as being the go-to place by BVA on this particular issue. The go-to place is seen as being the British Cattle Veterinary Association, because this is seen as being a TB control issue, not a wildlife protection or welfare issue. And that's the kind of discussion we need to have, and that's really what we need to try and change. So, you know, we are sort of talking about all the time about how we might do that. I mentioned the British Veterinary Association's animal welfare framework and animal welfare policy. Do have a read of it if you have a chance. It's a very interesting document. And I still think, even though we haven't so far managed to make much progress using it, I still think that it's a good basis for us to be trying to continually trying to approach BVA. It's BVA's own strategy, you know, and although it wasn't written particularly with wildlife in mind, many of the aspects of it would relate to wildlife protection, and it talks of the veterinary profession as having to seek to promote the best interests of animals wherever they are used or impacted by people. It talks about advocating animal interests, animal welfare interests in policy formulation. And it talks about applying animal welfare assessments and tools and developing ethical frameworks when formulating BVA policy. So there's an opportunity there to use all that kind of fancy language, if you like, to say, actually, we think you should go and revisit this issue, and you know, and in future visit all wildlife-related issues within the framework of that policy. And I believe that if they do that, and if they do it in a sort of logical way, then they may well come to very different conclusions. But the problem always comes back with BVA to the fact that BVA ultimately is not a scientific organisation. It's not an evidence-based organisation. It considers evidence, but it's a member organisation, and its positions are driven by its membership, and its membership have all kinds of vested interests. So it's always a battle, but we're certainly trying to do what we can to change that.
Thank you, Mark. We are really pushed for time. I know we've got some questions here, but we've really got to finish this in 5 minutes because you've got to get lunch in half an hour. Can I just have a quick show of hands for those people in this room that believe there should be a new voice for the veterinary industry in Britain that cares for wildlife based on science and ethics? Well It's a very, very strong argument, I think, that we do need some organisation to be established that brings vets together with conservationists and wildlife, so we can take that point away. I'll take one more question. Who's, I think the gentleman there on the far left by the windows had his hand up. It will have to be the last one. I do apologise, because I need to get you fed, so we can talk to the panel during lunch. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Keith Child from the Royal Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, Badger Trust supporter. I desperately need the panel to help me learn if some of the ideas that I learned from previous conferences have any value. My first conference was hosted by the Lancashire Group in 2008, where we had a discussion of very similar nature to this one. Don Hunford, who many of us will know, stood up and asked, is there any chance that there are breeds or individuals in the cattle population that enjoy natural immunity to the disease? Dr. Petra Carpenter was on the panel, and she said immediately, yes, extremely likely. And also, she said, her opinion as a genetic scientist led her to believe that it was a routine genetic science procedure to identify the gene which offers this immunity, and it could be identified in strains or individual cattle.
Can we just take that one? So if you got a number, because that in itself...
Well, if I can just carry on and say that in subsequent conferences, okay, we heard from a livestock cattle manager, who was a very interesting speaker at a conference like ours, Steve Jones, and he said that what this was leading us to believe was there was a potential solution in hybrid vigour in the cattle herds if you could introduce the natural immunity from those animals that enjoy it. But it would mean that the dairy industry in particular would have to accept that they would have lower production because it was not from their treasured pedigree herds. Is any of those things of any value?
Yeah, so Mark, do you want to say
that? Just a very quick response. I can't answer. I suspect that different breeds of cattle, and maybe on an individual or certainly on a breed basis, may have different levels of susceptibility to TB, and the infection might take rather different courses. I don't know that for sure. What I would say is that I think our increasingly intensified farming industry puts cattle under enormous metabolic pressure, and that metabolic pressure and stress inevitably affects their ability to respond to infectious disease and all kinds of other potential stressors. And I think that's something that the veterinary profession as a whole needs to be very concerned about, not just because of TB control, but because of the implications for the welfare of those animals.
Yeah. Sorry.
Liz, you go first.
So a couple of things. If you think of everybody in this room on the world population, a third of you will be infected with TB, but only 1 in 10 of those people will go on and develop disease. The way we know you're infected, if you remember those of you as old as me and had BCG vaccine, is we had a skin test. What we do is cattle is we skin test and we cull them. So we're selecting against the animals that have a natural immune response. Admittedly, there are also ones that have been exposed to disease. So we've probably naturally selected against, natural resistance in what we've done, whilst at the same time selecting for other traits which probably aren't very good ones. But the problem is with TB is that if you're in that 10% that have got it, who will go on and develop disease, we don't know when you'll develop it, and that will be very much be affected by how much stress you have. So say if you get cancer and you put on steroids, your TB will come out. And as Mark was saying, a lot of the practices we use are really good ones for stimulating disease to come out because we're stressing animals. So really the whole way cattle production is set up is not ideal for TB prevention, because we're selecting the wrong animals if we're just looking at TB, and then we're stressing them, which makes the disease come out. So it doesn't really work terribly well. But you're right, I think there's some work in Scotland recently looking at genetics of cattle that had increased resistance to it, so people have been doing that.
Thank you, Alex.
Well, I don't think
Well, we're going to take that as the last question, and I just want to say thank you to the panel. I think it's been a very interesting discussion and great contributions again from the our audience. So thank you very much.